So we've started year 11 with our control assessment topic, which is on the USA 1919 to 1941. So I thought it might be quite useful we have some weekly or fortnightly videos just to recap on what we've learned. So over the past fortnight, we've been looking at the American political system, the two main political parties, and 1920s America, particularly focusing on the economic boom time.
I'm really rich. I'll show you that in a second.
Let's have another look at those. So let's start with the two main political parties. A donkey and an elephant. Now hopefully you remember that these are the symbols for the two main political parties. The donkey represents the Democrats and the elephant represents the Republicans. But what's the difference between the two? Well, let's start with the Democrats. Now as you can see, the Democrats tend to have some more modern ideas. So when it comes to traditional issues, Democrats would take the view that actually let's modernize those issues because American society is changing. So the idea of a family, whereas traditional views might argue that a family has to have a father and a mother, the Democrats would be more accepting of the ideas that a modern American family can have two fathers or two mothers instead. The other big deal with the Democrats is about the size of the government, and that's not literally the size of the government necessarily, but the Democrats take the view that the American government should be there to help out the whole of the society. So particularly focusing on the people who need help the most, which would be the poor people of society. So the Democrats would argue that the role of the government is to interfere with the lives of people in society to try and help them out as much as they can.
My administration will not rest until every American can find a job.
It could also be that they provide medical insurance for people to ensure that everyone has the ability to be able to pay for expensive medical bills. So the Democrats would argue that the role of the government is to try and help out everyone, and that includes the poor people. One last thing is to pay for this, you'd have to have heavier taxes.
We have a very tight budget to do what she's asking. We'd have to raise taxes.
Raise way too high as they are.
That's because the government's doing more things and the government needs taxes, needs that money to be able to do these things. So that's where heavier taxes come in. Now those taxes obviously have to come from people with the money, and so therefore, who's going to be taxed? Well, particularly the rich people. So the rich people will be charged more tax to pay for this big government. So what about the Republicans? How do they differ from the Democrats? Well, they have more traditional ideas. That's really important. So whereas the Democrats would argue American society needs to change and the government needs to change along with that, the Republicans would argue that no, change is wrong. Traditional ideas are better than these new modern ideas. So a family should have a mother and a father. Gun ownership. The Constitution, the American Constitution, says that every American has the right to bear arms. We shouldn't change those things because they're traditional and they're good old-fashioned values. And so the Republicans would argue we should not change those ideas. So the Republicans believe in small government. That's really important because they don't think that it's the government's role to interfere with people's lives. They argue that we should all be in charge of our own destinies. And actually, if we want to succeed, we should be allowed to. And if we can't be bothered to put the effort in, then we should be allowed to fail. And they disagree with the Democrats that it's the role of the government to try and help out everyone equally, because their argument is, well, poor people, they just need to pull their socks up. They need to put more effort in. And it's not the role of the government, they would argue, to do that for you. It's not the role of the government to make sure you have access to all these things, like healthcare and a decent education. It's up to you. So it's up to you to provide for your family to make sure that they have access to all these things. And because of this, they don't need a big government. And so they charge less taxes. The other side of this, of course, is they believe that if you charge heavy taxes, it's almost like you're punishing people for being successful. But surely that's what all Americans should be, successful. So why punish them by charging them heavy taxes? So the Republicans take the view that if you want to be successful, we're not going to interfere with you. And once you are successful, we won't charge you lots of heavy taxes. And that's how American society should run. Everyone should be driven to their own success. The government should not interfere. So next we looked at why did 1920s America experience a boom? And there's several reasons for this. First of all, we have World War I. Now, America was very proactive in supplying weapons and arms and materials to the European countries in World War I. And so they made a bit of money out of that. The British borrowed money from the Americans, as did the French. Of course, this weakened the British and the French economies and the German economy. The Germans were massively in debt at the end of World War I, but they weren't alone. By the mid-1920s, 44% of the United Kingdom's government expenditure, so the money that the British government is paying, 44% of it was going on interest on loans. That's a huge amount. So the British are struggling hugely after World War I. It's the same with France. Obviously, France experienced a lot of damage during World War I, and they're slowly recovering from that. Of course, America didn't suffer this damage, and it actually made money out of World War I. So the United States saw its industries expand during World War I, which meant that it became the strongest industrial power, even more industrial than Germany, who was its closest rival at the time. By the 1920s, the Americans were going through this period of isolationism, where politicians were arguing that we should never get involved in wars in Europe and in squabbles in Europe because it just leads to the loss of American lives when we have to send our troops out there. So the Americans decided to follow this policy of isolationism to steer clear from all of that. The other strand of isolationism is that the Americans wanted to make sure that the American people continued to buy American products so that the American economy continued to do well. So they thought, how can we make sure that people aren't buying products from abroad? And so what they did was they set up import tariffs. Now, import tariffs are like a tax zone. So if people in America wanted to buy parts or products from abroad, when they come into America, they'd be hit with a tax. Of course, that cost would be passed on to the consumer, or to the person who's buying in America, which means that goods from abroad will become more expensive. Hopefully, that would encourage people in America to continue to buy American goods instead of goods from abroad. If they're doing that, then the American economy continues to grow. But why else? Well, we start to see new technologies being developed. For example, introduction of washing machines. And with electricity being adopted in more and more houses, we start to see more of a demand for things like washing machines, kettles, fridges, which means that people wanting to go and buy American goods, and of course if they're going out there and buying American goods, the American companies are going to do well. And if American companies are doing well, they need to hire more people to make these things. And so more jobs come available. And with more jobs becomes more money, and so a cycle of prosperity happens, where American industry is growing, more jobs are being created, everyone's a winner. And with more jobs, people gain more money, which means that people can spend more on goods, which means that more jobs are created, and so the cycle continues. So we start to see people investing in this new technology. In fact, we start to also see higher purchase. So even if your job, you cannot afford to buy a washing machine outright, companies realised, hang on, what we could do instead was break down the cost of buying that into monthly payments, which makes it affordable.
The customer gets the products they want today while making affordable weekly or monthly payments over time.
So let's say we have a $50 washing machine and a family can't afford it. Instead, what American companies might ask for is $5 a month for a year. Now I know what you're thinking, you math magicians, but sir, that's $60 altogether. Yeah, higher purchase means you have to pay a little bit more, but on the plus side, $5 a month is far more affordable than $50 up front. And because of this, we start to see a lot of people adopting this higher purchase, this buy now, pay later policy, which means that more people are buying goods. So we continue to see that demand for American goods.
You can't afford $300 a month?
No.
Well, what about $10 a day?
Easy!
But why? Why are we seeing so many American goods being produced? Well, that's down to mass production. Massive factories start springing up all over the country to try and produce goods very quickly. Now, the godfather of this idea is Henry Ford. His company, Ford Motors, realised that actually we could produce more cars if we have a conveyor belt within our factory, and people specialised in building different parts of the car to produce cars quicker. Indeed, the River Rouge factory in Detroit was able to produce a Model T Ford every 3 minutes in the 1920s. By 1929, there were 26 million cars on American roads. And with this demand for cars, we see a boost in the glass industry, leather industries, metal industries, rubber industries, because cars require all these materials. And so the boom in cars is producing a boom in other industries, which means that, again, more companies are doing well during this period. And lastly, we have the stock market. So businessmen could sell shares in their company for a percentage of the profits later on. This was fantastic because the more money they received by selling shares, the more money they could put into their business, which means that hopefully profits would grow later on and everyone's a winner. So if you bought 10% of shares in one company, you get 10% of their profits. Because this became popular and because the stock market was growing, a lot of people, normal people, middle class people, were starting to invest in the stock market, thinking, well, hang on, it's golden. The more money, more shares I buy, the better the profits will be. In fact, I'm just going to get my money back soon.
Now, before I execute this order, are you sure you understand the risks of stock ownership?
Absolutely.
And so the stock market grows exponentially because loads of people start buying shares. In fact, you can even buy shares on a buy now, pay later basis. So we start to see the stock market really expand. And with the expansion of the stock market, we see businesses get richer and normal people getting a percentage of profits back again, which sees them get wealthier too. It's win-win. So it's an economic boom. Everyone's doing well. Aren't they? Well, no, not really. Farmers struggled a lot in the 1920s, and the reason why links back to World War I. Now, during World War I, the American government really encouraged farmers to produce as much as they can because there was a greater demand for food, because they were exporting it abroad, they were trying to feed their troops, particularly in 1918, and they needed lots of food. And so the American farmers managed to increase production because there was more land available to them because the government gave them more land. So it was a boom time, World War I, for the farmers because they were producing lots of food and getting lots of money due to the demand for it. However, when we get into peacetime in the 1920s, demand drops. In fact, it drops hugely. And with a drop in demand, we see a drop in the price that a farmer can ask for their produce. Because if there's less demand, you can't charge as much as you did before. As such, farmers really struggle. And earlier we said about American import tariffs protecting American industries. Well, that did not apply to the agricultural sector. And so Americans could buy foreign goods at a competitive price compared to American farmers' produce. So the American farmers really had a tough time of it. Now, what about women? Now, women traditionally are seen as having a golden age during the 1920s because there was more jobs available, and so women could take those jobs, get their own wage, and then spend it on things like cigarettes and alcohol. And so emerges this new type of women called the flappers, who have this disposable income, could go out to nightclubs and have a good time. And whilst that is true to an extent, it does not reflect women across the range. A classic case of example, if a woman has the same job as a man, chances are the man will get paid more money than the woman because the company can get away with that because it's just expected that women will be paid less.
I'm paid very little.
Laws were changed to try and protect women as well, so we start to see laws passed that stop women from working night shifts because they should be at home helping the children, having to raise the children, look after the children. Of course, this is bad for women because that means that companies could look at this and go, well, hang on, I need my employees to work night shifts. Sorry, women.
You are fired.
So that's a problem for women too. So this isn't a golden age for women. Women are still getting less wages than men. They are facing layoffs due to changes in law. And even when there are positive laws to help women, such as laws to increase their benefits during pregnancy, they're designed to encourage women to stay at home whilst they rely on their husbands to go out and get the money. So it's still a very sexist mindset that the government has in the 1920s. This is also certainly not a golden time for the ethnic minorities in America. So let's start with black people. The United States has a huge racism problem in the 1920s, and what's worse is that many of these problems are ingrained in law. So for example, in the southern United States in particular, whites and black people were segregated apart. They were kept apart, so you could have a school for white people and a school for black people. Now the problem with that, obviously apart from the lack of social cohesion, is that the school for white people would tend to have more money put into it than the school for black people, and so black children aren't educated, if they're educated at all, anywhere near as well as the white children are. Which means that later on we're still going to have this divide between wealthy white children growing up to become successful and the black children who won't grow up to be as successful due to that lack of education. We also see a problem with just attitudes towards black people. So when jobs have come up, it was legal to just ask only for white people and not for black people. Because of the racism, that keeps a divide between the potential for black people to succeed and the potential for white people to succeed as well, which is a big issue in America. You also have the problem of, in the United States, a lot of the black people lived in the southern United States and worked in the farming industry. Now, as we've seen, the farmers don't do particularly well in the 1920s either, which means that the black farm labourers aren't doing so well either. and we start to see people being fired and let go, which means that they have more money problems too. Things are also tough for the Native Americans. Now by now, in the 1920s, Native Americans only account for 0.2% of the American population. So whilst they're not a big minority, they're still being discriminated against. Now the American government had a policy in the 1800s in particular to move Native Americans away from their ancestral lands and put them in reservations. The problem with these reservations was that they were quite infertile, which made it difficult for Native Americans to continue their old way of life. Because of this, they were struggled in the 1920s because there's not enough food that they can grow. Now we start to see in the 1920s the American government give more Native American citizenship. So in 1924, a law was passed saying that all Native Americans can now apply to be American citizens. That in theory, that should give them the right to things like voting. But some states, particularly the ones in the southern United States, created laws which make it difficult for Native Americans to be able to vote. Things like a literacy test. They would say you need to pass a literacy test before you're eligible to vote, which many Native Americans would be able to do because they did not have the same quality of education as the white Americans. It was an extra barrier between them and their legal right to have a vote in elections. So you might remember in our Germany topic we talked about the 1920s as being the golden age for Germany. We call it the golden years. And this is very similar. On the surface, there does seem to be a lot of success, a lot of wealth being generated, which means that we could justifiably call it the boom years or the golden years. However, when you scratch below the surface, you start to appreciate that actually that success is not spread across the nation. And in fact, large groups of people struggle during this period. Well, that's what we have in America. So whilst, yes, many people refer to 1920s as the boom years, and it certainly is for American economy and for middle class families who can afford to buy these new goods, it's not available to everyone.